The morning of August 6, 1945, began like any other in Tokyo. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the military leaders of Japan were focused on the war. They were planning for a final massive battle on the Japanese homeland. They believed the American invasion was coming soon, and they were ready to fight to the last man. Then, the first confusing reports arrived from the city of Hiroshima. The messages were broken and hard to understand. They spoke of a single American airplane. They mentioned a flash of light brighter than the sun. Then, a massive explosion that seemed to wipe out the entire city. In Tokyo, the generals were confused. A single plane could not destroy a city. It was impossible. The reports had to be wrong. Maybe it was a new kind of firebombing. Maybe it was a huge accident at a weapons factory. They refused to believe what they were hearing. A young officer entered the war room with a new message. He looked pale. "The communication with Hiroshima has stopped," he said. "There is only silence." This was the most frightening sign of all. A city does not just go silent. Still, the generals tried to find a normal explanation. "The communication lines were destroyed by a fire," one general said. "It was a very large raid, not a single plane," argued another. They could not bring themselves to say the words atomic bomb. The idea was too terrible. They knew that Germany and America had been trying to build such a weapon. But they believed it was a scientific dream, years away from being real. They were sure that their American enemies were not capable of such a thing. Finally, they decided to send an expert to Hiroshima. They chose a top scientist, Dr. Yoshio Nishina. His job was to go to the ruined city and find out what really happened. As Dr. Nishina prepared for his journey, the generals in Tokyo held on to their hope. They hoped it was all a terrible mistake. They hoped they were not facing a new kind of war. But deep down, a seed of fear had been planted. The silence from Hiroshima was louder than any explosion. While Dr. Nishina traveled to the ruins of Hiroshima, the generals in Tokyo held an emergency meeting. The room was filled with smoke and tension. They knew something terrible had happened, but their minds fought against the most obvious and terrifying explanation. War Minister Korechika Anami, a powerful and respected general, stood before the map of Japan. "We must not panic," he said firmly. "What happened in Hiroshima was a tragedy, but it was not a miracle. The Americans have not changed the rules of war." This was the beginning of their great denial. The generals, who had spent their lives studying warfare, began to create a story they could live with. They could not accept that their enemy had a weapon that could end the war in an instant. A senior officer presented their new theory. "We believe the Americans have developed a new type of conventional bomb," he explained. "A special bomb. It is much larger and more powerful than anything we have seen before. It may contain a new type of explosive, but it is not an atomic bomb." Another general nodded in agreement. "Think about the resources needed to build an atomic bomb," he argued. "It would take years and enormous factories. Our intelligence would have discovered such a project. The Americans could not have kept it secret." This idea became their shield against the truth. They convinced themselves that the United States might have had enough material for one atomic test, but no more. They believed the Hiroshima bomb was either that single test, or it was simply a massive new conventional weapon. "The Americans are trying to scare us into surrender," War Minister Anami declared. "They want us to think they have godlike power. But we will not be tricked. We will fight on. When they invade our homeland, we will make them pay for every inch of land with their blood." This decision was not just about pride. The generals truly believed that if Japan could inflict enough casualties on the invading American forces, they could negotiate a better peace deal. They were willing to sacrifice millions of Japanese lives for this goal. They decided to wait for Dr. Nishina's official report. But in their hearts, they had already made up their minds. They would dismiss any evidence that did not fit their story. The lives of the people in Nagasaki and the future of Japan itself now depended on these few men who were refusing to see the truth. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, arrived on the outskirts of Hiroshima on August 7th. The train could go no further. The tracks were twisted and melted. He continued on foot, and with every step, the world around him became more and more like a nightmare. He was a scientist, a man of logic and reason, but what he saw defied all reason. The city was not just damaged, it was erased. Where buildings once stood, there was now a flat, scorched plain of ash and rubble. The few concrete structures that remained were just hollow shells. The air smelled of smoke and something else, something bitter and strange. He saw people who looked unharmed at first, but then he noticed the strange patterns on their skin. Their clothes had left dark shadows burned directly into their flesh. Others were vomiting, their hair falling out in clumps. They were dying from a sickness he recognized from his research: radiation poisoning. This was the final, undeniable proof. A conventional bomb, no matter how large, could not do this. Only an atomic bomb, splitting atoms and releasing the energy trapped inside, could create this kind of invisible, lingering death. He worked quickly, taking notes and measurements. He examined the direction of the blast shadows, which pointed directly to a single point in the sky where the bomb had exploded. He gathered samples of the rubble. Every piece of evidence told the same story. That night, in a makeshift office, he drafted his report to Tokyo. His hand was steady, but his heart was heavy. He wrote with absolute certainty. He described the unique temperatures, the specific types of destruction, and the clear signs of radiation. His conclusion was simple and terrifying. There is no scientific doubt. The city of Hiroshima was destroyed by a single uranium-based atomic bomb. The power of the enemy's weapon is absolute. He sent the message, believing that the truth would now force the generals to act. They would have to surrender. They would have to save Japan from total destruction. Back in Tokyo, the generals received Dr. Nishina's report. War Minister Anami read it aloud in the war room. When he finished, there was a long, heavy silence. Then, the denial began again. "How can we trust one man's opinion?" one general asked. "Dr. Nishina is a brilliant scientist, but he is not a military man," said another. "He does not understand the enemy's tricks. This could be an elaborate deception." They chose to believe their own fears and pride over the facts from a world-renowned expert. They filed the report away and continued their planning. The verdict of science had been delivered, but the generals refused to accept it. The countdown to the next disaster continued. On August 8th, 2 days after the destruction of Hiroshima, Japan's 6 most powerful leaders gathered in an underground bunker in Tokyo. This group, called the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, would decide the fate of the nation. The air in the room was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The meeting began with the facts. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, an older man who favored peace, spoke first. "We have Dr. Nishina's report," he said, his voice tired. "He confirms it was an atomic bomb. We must face this new reality." Then, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo spoke. "The Americans have promised a reign of ruin," he warned. "If they have more of these bombs, they will use them. We must accept the Allies' terms and end this war now. It is our only way to save Japan." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the military men responded. War Minister Korechika Anami slammed his fist on the table. "No," he shouted. "This is exactly what the enemy wants. They want us to surrender without a fight." His face was red with anger. "How do we know the Americans have more than one bomb? Building such a weapon must have taken all their resources. I believe Hiroshima was their only one." The other military leaders nodded. General Yoshijiro Umezu, the Army Chief of Staff, spoke next. "Our plan remains," he said coldly. "When the Americans invade, we will meet them on the beaches. We will make them pay for every inch of land with their blood. The casualties will be so high that they will beg for peace on our terms." The military leaders truly believed this. They thought they could still win a better peace through one final bloody battle. They called it Ketsu Go, the decisive operation. The peace party tried to reason with them. "How many Japanese people will die in this battle?" asked the prime minister. "Millions! And now we face atomic bombs too." But the generals would not listen. Their pride, their sense of military honor, and their complete misunderstanding of their enemy blinded them. They voted to continue the war. As the meeting ended, the 6 men left the room. They were divided, 3 against 3. No decision had been made. Japan would keep fighting. In their bunker, surrounded by maps and plans for a glorious last stand, the generals had chosen delusion over reality. And while they debated, an American bomber named Boxcar was being loaded with a second atomic bomb, this one called Fat Man. The morning of August 9th arrived in Tokyo. The generals who had voted to continue the war felt confident in their decision. They were finalizing plans to move the emperor to a safe mountain hideout. They were mobilizing every citizen, arming them with bamboo spears for the final battle. They believed they had called America's bluff. Then, at 11:02 a.m., a new message arrived. It was from the port city of Nagasaki. The message was fragmented, just like the one from Hiroshima days before. It spoke of a single B-29 bomber, a blinding flash, a mushroom cloud. In the war room, the generals fell silent. The blood drained from War Minister Anami's face. For a long minute, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of an electric fan. The impossible had happened. The thing they had sworn could not be true was true. The Americans did not have just one atomic bomb. They had a second one. The generals' entire theory, their entire strategy, collapsed in that single moment. Their belief that Hiroshima was a special bomb, or a one-time weapon, was revealed as a fatal fantasy. Their plan to fight a glorious last stand was now a plan for national suicide. A young officer rushed in with more details. The destruction in Nagasaki is complete. The city is gone. The mood in the room shifted from arrogance to terror. A terrible new question now haunted them. If the Americans had a second bomb, what was to stop them from having a third? Or a 10th? How many cities did they plan to erase? General Anami, who had been so defiant just hours before, now looked like a broken man. He stared at the map of Japan, his eyes moving from Hiroshima to Nagasaki. Where would the next one fall? Tokyo? Kyoto? How long until Japan was nothing but a chain of radioactive ruins? The shock of the second bomb shattered the deadlock in the government. The military's voice was no longer the loudest in the room. The power shifted to the emperor and the peace party. The generals' pride had just cost Japan a second city. Their refusal to see the truth had led directly to this moment. Now, they had no more arguments left. The reality of the atomic age had arrived, and it was far more terrible than they had ever allowed themselves to imagine. The news from Nagasaki changed everything. The confident arguments of the generals now seemed foolish and dangerous. That evening, the Supreme Council met again. The atmosphere was completely different. The room was heavy with fear and the weight of their terrible mistake. The peace party, led by the prime minister, did not need to say, "I told you so." The destruction of a second city said it for them. Instead, Prime Minister Suzuki spoke calmly but firmly. "We have seen the evidence twice now," he said. "The American threat was real. To continue is to accept the total destruction of Japan." The military leaders were silent. War Minister Anami, who had been so loud and certain before, stared at the table. His pride was gone, replaced by the horrifying understanding that he had been wrong. His refusal to believe the truth had directly led to the deaths of tens of thousands more people in Nagasaki. The most terrifying question was now on everyone's mind. How many more bombs did the Americans have? An aide entered the room with a new intelligence report. It was an intercepted American radio broadcast repeating the promise of a reign of ruin. The message was clear. The bombings would continue until Japan surrendered. This was the final blow. The strategy of fighting one last battle was meaningless. if the enemy could destroy cities from the air, one by one, without ever setting foot on the beaches. Seeing that the council was still deadlocked, Prime Suzuki made a bold move. He declared that the only way to break the stalemate was to ask the emperor himself to decide. This was an unprecedented step. The emperor was a symbol, not a decision-maker. But these were unprecedented times. Later that night, Emperor Hirohito entered the bunker. The council members bowed deeply. The emperor listened silently as both sides presented their cases one last time. When they finished, he stood and spoke in a quiet voice. "I cannot bear to see my people suffer any longer," he said. "The time has come to bear the unbearable." He had chosen surrender. The emperor's word was final. The debate was over. The generals, who had held so much power for so long, bowed their heads in obedience. Their will to fight had been broken, not by an invasion, but by the terrible, undeniable power of the atomic bomb. A power they had refused to believe in until it was too late for the city of Nagasaki.